So, welcome to this video. Today I will show you how to actually use the FlaxFlow add-on in a more practical sense, and this time I will take a more casual approach to it. I also want to mention that in the last video I said that I'm currently working on a FlaxTracks update. I have actually changed my trajectory and I'm currently working on a new add-on which will include real-time camera tracking, mesh generation, GPU accelerated point cloud generation and much more. So stay tuned for that. Another thing I want to mention is that I have added a full documentation page for FlaxFlow. So if there are any questions, make sure to read this first and then it should give you the answer. If you still have any questions, you can contact me here in the comment section down below, or you can contact me on Blendermarket and I will try to answer as best as I can. So when you purchase the FlaxFlow add-on, you will receive 4 files. These 2 are the latest version, and this one is for Mac and this one is for Windows. Currently I do not have any build for the Linux operating system. However, you may still be able to use it for Linux if you just download one of these files and then download OpenCV using pip and retarget the installation to the OpenCV folder in the add-on. However, there is no guarantee that it works for Linux, so make sure that you have a Mac or a Windows computer. So the next step is to open Blender and then go into Edit, Preferences, and in the Extensions tab, click this little down button and click Install from disk. Then just locate it on your computer and install the zip file. Next, go into the add-ons folder and here you should be able to find the FlaxFlow add-on and just make sure to enable it. The next step is to go into the motion tracking area, and now you should be able to see the FlaxFlow in the left hand side. You will see a lot of settings here. The first thing you will need is a footage to work with, so I will just use a example footage for this tutorial. So once that is done, open the first tab in the FlaxFlow menu. And now you will see the first settings. So the first button you see here, when you click this, it will tell the FlaxFlow add-on to look at the current active footage. So for example, if you have 5 footages, the one that you clicked this button on the last time will be the footage that the FlaxFlow add-on actually looks at. So always make sure to click this button when you want to change your footage. So now I just click this and you can see that the rest of the settings become available. The next setting is to set the scene frames, and once I click this, you can see that the number of frames gets adjusted to the length of the video you're currently tracking. The next setting is the Apply Recommended Settings button, and when you click this, it will apply all the recommended settings that I have found working best. So when you click the Prefetch button here, you can see that the footage gets loaded just as regular. And the next one is the load footage for optical trackers. When you click this, the add-on will look at the current active footage and go into that folder and then use that and load that footage into the optical trackers. So when I click this, you can see that Blender froze for some seconds and now it has loaded into the optical trackers. Currently I'm using a video, not a image sequence, but both of them will work. Next one is the memory cache limit, and this is the same as you would find in the preferences. So the next step is to start tracking your footage, and here FlaxFlow offers 2 alternatives. Either you can choose to track it with the native trackers. This button corresponds to this button up here, so both of them are the same buttons, just at 2 different locations. And then it also offers a second alternative to track the footage, which is the optical trackers. So if you click this one or this one, it doesn't matter because both of them are the same. And when you click either one of these settings, it will look at the current active settings in this panel and then apply them. However, each of them looks at different settings. So for example, the native tracker here looks at the settings in this box, while the optical tracker looks at these 2 and these 4 settings as well as these 3 settings, but not these, because these just adjust the trackers, for example pattern size and search size and so on. So let me start with the native tracker. If I disable the added tracker and the rest of the settings here, it will not do anything when I click on it. So in order for it to work, I first need to add a tracker like this, add some trackers, and then select them and then click it, and now it will use the current selected trackers and then just track them forward and backwards. If you would like the add-on to add the trackers for you, just enable the add trackers, and now when you click this button you can see that the frame fills with trackers and it tracks those newly added trackers forward and backwards. You saw that the trackers got added on the current active frame. So for example, if I move to the frame 190 and then do the same procedure and click this button, you can see that the trackers added on the current frame and then gets tracked forward and backwards. However, if you would like the add-on to add the trackers on the frame with the lowest number of trackers, just enable this setting, and once you do this, the next time I click this, it will look at each of these numbers here, which corresponds to the number of frames on that specific frame. So for example, if I move the playhead to this frame over here, here it says that it currently has 106 total active trackers. So if I disable the non-active trackers with Alt-D and I would start counting all of these currently active trackers, we would see that currently there's 106 active trackers. The other number below this is the coverage, and it describes how many percent of the frame is currently covered with the trackers. This area is covered with trackers, which corresponds to around 44% of the entire frame. So now when I have enabled the fewest trackers and click this, it will not add the trackers on the current frame, but instead jump to the frame with the fewest number of trackers. So in this case, we could see that over here, there's only one active tracker. So it should jump to the first one, which has the lowest number of trackers. So for example, if this frame would have one tracker and this also had one tracker and so on, it would still jump to the first one with the fewest number of trackers. So if I just click this now, you can see that it jumps to the first frame with one tracker and then just tracks them. And if I do this, continue to this, it would continue jumping to the frame with the fewest number of trackers and add some trackers over there. If I now would delete all of the newly added trackers and use the lowest coverage instead, and then click the native track forward and backwards, it would jump to the first frame and add some trackers. And then if I click this again, it will jump to the frame with the lowest coverage rate and just continue adding trackers and so on. So in this case, we can see that the frame with the current lowest coverage rate is around over here. We can see that it only has, for example, 23% of the current frame covered with trackers. If I would hide the non-active trackers, you can see it more easily. So if I would just move over the playhead over here and then click track forward and backwards, you can see that it jumps over here and then adds trackers over here to try to increase the coverage rate on that frame, which it did. And if you instead would like to use the optical trackers, make sure to click this button instead. And once you do that, it will still look at the settings that you have applied over here. For example, if I disable this, go to frame 50 and then click the optical trackers, you can see that it adds trackers and it adds them from frame 50. So if you instead would like to use the optical trackers, currently I have only enabled the add trackers. So if I go to frame 60 and then click this button, you can see that trackers gets added from frame 60 and then forwards and backwards. But if I instead would use the fewest trackers, enable this and now click the optical tracker, it will jump to the frame with the lowest number of trackers and then add trackers from there instead. Now we will jump into the settings and what each of them do. So for the native trackers, I will just delete all of them. So for the optical tracker, it will look at these settings over here. These we have already covered, and these ones are the same as you would find in the regular camera tracker in Blender. So for example, the pattern size, the search size is the same as you would find over here. So for example, if I decrease this number to 15 and this to 30 and then add the trackers, you can see that the pattern size for each of the trackers are very small. If I delete them again and increase this and now do this, you can see that they have changed. For the optical trackers, we have first these two settings. This setting decides how much change between the frames is acceptable for optical tracking. So for example, if you have a very shaky footage, you may need to increase this parameter in order for the trackers to not disappear. In order for the trackers to actually continue tracking, you may also need to decrease the optical threshold. This is the minimum eigenvalue threshold for the optical trackers. So if you have a really shaky footage, you may need to decrease this a lot, and when you decrease this, it will allow the trackers to continue tracking even when you have very shaky footage and a high uncertainty in the track. So for example, if I increase this threshold very much and then decrease this and now add optical trackers, you can see that most of them actually gets disabled after just one frame. When you increase the pattern size for the optical trackers, the preview of them just changes, but the actual optical track does not get affected of these numbers. So if I increase this and increase this, you can see that the preview of the trackers just gets larger, but the actual track does not get affected. So now you can see that most of the trackers actually get disabled after just one frame. And in order to fix this, just as I mentioned, you need to decrease the optical threshold and also increase the optical tracker max change. And this will allow the trackers to track in more uncertain situation or in a larger motion. So if I now click the optical tracker, you can see that all of the trackers continue to track further. These settings over here also affect how the optical trackers track. So when you increase the pattern size, the optical trackers will become more stable, but it will also lead to more drifting, and a lower value will lead to a less stable track but less drifting. This is due to when you increase the number, the optical tracker will look at a larger area, and it will look at a larger area instead of just a single feature. That's why you need to keep this at a relatively small value if you would like to track a small feature. So for example, if I increase this very much to, for example, 100 and then add a tracker on this feature over here, and now disable the add trackers, so I just track the selected tracker over here and then click track, you can see that the tracker tracks forward and backwards. But here you can see that it leads to some drifting due to it actually looking at a much greater area than just the little small dot over here. If I lock the view, you can see that it starts to drift, and that's of course not what we want. So in order to fix this, we need a relatively small number for the pattern size. If I go down to, for example, 15 and now add a tracker and then track that tracker forward, you can see that this tracker does not have any drifting. So make sure to adjust that parameter if you notice that the trackers starts to slide. Next is the pyramids level. A higher number allows the optical trackers to process greater motion, and a lower number makes the trackers more jittery and shaky, which is not good. So here, a greater number actually improves the tracking quality. However, a higher value may affect the tracking speed. So always make sure that you have a good number. I would recommend you to use, for example, 10, which is a good balance between speed and quality. Next is the optical iterations, and a higher value increases the accuracy of the tracking, and a lower value makes it less accurate. However, this will also increase the tracking time, so a number of 40 is pretty good. Lastly, we have the threshold for the minimum change between successive iterations, and in 99% of the cases I would just leave this value as it is, and the same goes for the iterations and pyramids level, and I would just play around with the pattern size because this one is the one that actually affects the track quality the most. But you can also try to play around with this if you notice that the trackers does not behave as you want it. But if you would like more information about these settings, make sure to go into Blendermarket, and then in the documentation page, make sure to read about the features that you have questions about, and I think it will give you a clearer understanding of what they actually do. So now I will just add trackers over the entire scene. So I will enable add trackers and then enable the fewest trackers. By the way, if you enable the fewest trackers and the lowest coverage, it will find the frame with fewest trackers and then the frame with the lowest coverage, and then take the frame in between those frames. This might lead to situations where, for example, the frame with the fewest number of trackers is in the beginning while the lowest coverage rate is at the end, thus making the add-on add trackers in the middle of the footage, which you maybe don't want. So that's why I recommend you to either use the fewest trackers or the lowest coverage feature. But in this case I will just use the fewest trackers because I found it to work the best. So now I will just use the native trackers for this example, and I can disable the lock preview. Now I have added trackers on all of the frames. And the next part is the filter and solve tracks. So the first operation here is the FlaxSolve. The FlaxSolve is just a improved version of the regular Blender solver. It often leads to better results. In this case, we could see that we have a lot of bad trackers moving all over the place. If I would just click the solve to demonstrate, you can see that we get a pretty bad solve error. When you use the Flax solver, each of the trackers gets its own color based on how bad its solve error is. To view this better, you can see in the dope sheet editor over here, you can see that the worst tracker gets a reconstruction error of 148 and so on. For example, if I delete this and delete the second best and now use the Flax solver again, we can now see that the worst tracker has a solve error of 57, and then it goes down from there. When you use the Flax solver, it often leads to a better solve error, and you also get the color for each tracker, which allows you to very easily detect which trackers are bad. Next is the constraint feature. So if I, for example, know the focal length of the footage, I could lock the focal length, then go into the track page here, camera, lens, and then adjust the focal length to whatever I want. For example, if I just change this to 63 and then redo the Flax solve. So for example, if I were to change the focal length to, for example, 40 and now use the solver, we can see that the focal length is kept while the other distortion values gets estimated. So this allows you to specify which parameter you actually want to estimate. If I would lock these two and just reset them to 0 and now use the Flax solver again, we can see that the parameters gets kept while the focal length get estimated. So the next is the filter functions in the add-on. And by the way, the Flax solver is the same as the one you would find over here. So you can either click this one or this button over here. These correspond to the same operation. Next is the filtering tab. If you click the filter tracks over here or over here, it doesn't matter because each of them is. Next one is the filter button. And if you click this, you would see that the trackers gets filtered away depending on which settings you currently have active. So the first setting you see over here is the use number. If you enable this, you will have the option to adjust the number of trackers to be removed each filtration. So for example, if I increase this to 10 and click filter, it will remove the 10 worst trackers based on their reconstruction error. If I disable the delete option and now use the filter track, it will just select the 10 worst trackers. So if I click this, you can see that the worst 10 tracks gets selected. As you can see here, if we would start counting them, you can see that it is 10. So now if I click filter tracks, it will select the 10 worst features. So if I move this up, you can more easily see that it actually selected the 10 worst trackers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. If you instead would like the add-on to delete them for you each time you click the filter button, by the way, the filter button over here is the same as the one you find over here. But if I enable the delete and disable the resolve and now click filter tracks, it will delete those 10 worst tracks. So this allows you to very easily just spam the filter tracks button and it will continuously delete the 10 worst features in your track. If I disable the use number, it would instead use a percentage number of your total number of tracks set to 30%, and that means that the add-on will remove the 30% worst trackers in your footage. If I would enable the resolve and now click filter tracks, it will filter all the tracks based on their reprojection error. It will remove 30% of the worst trackers, delete them, and then also resolve. And the resolve uses the Flax solver. So if I click the filter tracks now, you can see that many of the trackers got removed and the add-on also resolved the entire scene. So now you can already see that we have a solve error of 0.64, which is already pretty good. If you now would click the filter button again, it will continuously remove 30% of the worst trackers in your scene. And now we even got a better solve error. And when I filtered the scene, you saw that an orange message appeared. If I open the info panel, the flag solve, some tracks were not calculated properly. Try removing the tracks with the fewest track frames. Or you can go into the deep sheet editor, go all the way down, and then in this case we see that one track actually don't have a reprojection error. So in this case I will just select it and then hit delete and remove it and then use the Flax solver again, and now we can see that we actually get a successful Flax solve. So that is a great tip. If you already have a good solve error and you still see the yellow message, go into the deep sheet editor, go all the way down and find the tracker and see if there are any tracks which don't currently have any reprojection error, and then just resolve and you should be good to go. Next is the minimum number for filtration. So currently it is set to 8, and this number describes the minimum tracks per each frame that is required for the filter to work. So if I would continuously hit the filter button, we could see that each time it removes the trackers, and soon we will see that some of the frames does not have so many tracks left. And if I continue clicking this button, you can see that currently these frames only have 8 tracks left. And now when I click the filter tracks again, you can see that it doesn't work because we have hit the filter limit, which is set to 8. So it basically describes the minimum number of tracks per each frame that is required for the filtration to actually work. So if I just hit Ctrl Z, so now we are back. You can see that we currently have a solve error of 0.28. And I actually noticed that we still have the optical center and distortion feature locked. So I will just unlock these and try to resolve it again. And now the solver will be able to adjust the optical center and lens distortion to whatever it wants, which will give us a better solution. One thing that you may have noticed was that when I click the filter button many times, you saw that the solve error actually decreased and may think that that is great. However, when you use the filter button too much, even if your solve error actually shows a good value, for example 0.1, a solve error of 28 as we have here might actually be better due to the fact that in this case we have more tracks for that the camera that the solve is actually based on. So sometimes a little higher solve error with more tracks is actually better than a solve error which is lower but also has less tracks. So in this case I will just stick with the solve error that we have now. Next is the find track outliers, and this is a separate way of filtering the tracks. So for example, if you notice that a track moves very weirdly, for example slides all over the footage or something like that, you can click the find track outliers and it will give each track its separate outlier score based on how weird its track pattern is. So for example, when I select track outliers, it will select the trackers which has a higher outlier score of 3. If I decrease this, it will select more of the trackers, and currently it says that this tracker has the highest outlier score, and if we look to it, we can see that it jitters around a bit and it behaves a little bit weird. If you notice, for example, that a frame goes all over the scene, that tracker would have a very high outlier value. So basically the find track outliers calculates how different each tracker moves in respect to all of the other trackers in the scene. But in this case we already have a pretty good solve error, so I won't mess with that setting too much. Next is the chest pattern calibrator, which was one of the new features in the FlaxFlow 1.1 update. And in this case, I won't go into it so much in depth. I would recommend you to go into the Blendermarket or Superhive as they call it now, and go into the documentation page on FlaxFlow and read a bit more about it. But I will just give a quick explanation here. So basically, this one allows you to adjust how many rows and columns the chest pattern that you have in your footage includes. Then you can just hit Flax chest pattern calibrator and it will go through each of the images in your image sequence that you have loaded. And next, when you click the Flax chest calibrator, it will go into each image in your image sequence and try to find a chest pattern with these dimensions. So in this case 7 rows and 10 columns, and then it will try to find the distortion on each of those chest patterns. But in this case I won't use it. When you use it you will get some principal points and a focal length. The next thing you should do is hit use chest pattern calibration values. If you will click this, it will automatically lock the focal length, optical center and distortion, and then instead use the calibration values that the chest calibrator just calculated. Next is the ST texture generator. This allows you to generate a ST texture pattern which you later can use in the compositing, which I showed you in the last video. I will also recommend you to go into the documentation panel and read more about it. But for now I will just continue with the scene that we currently have here. So the next thing is the add geometry, and in order to work with the geometry panel you first need to set up your scene. And since we already have a good solve error and a accepted solve, we can go into the solve panel here and click set up tracking scene as we usually do, and then you will see the trackers over here. So I will just go into the camera view and now over here select and then select 2 trackers that I will just use a scale and then try to scale it, as you can see here. So maybe something like that. Then I will actually use this one as the origin to move it a little bit. Now I might need to decrease the scale a little bit further. So now you can see that the scene is decently adjusted. To further adjust it better, you just select your camera and then over here use the 3D cursor as the orientation mode. So when you rotate the camera now, it will rotate around the 3D cursor, which is in the middle of the scene, which allows us to very easily orient the scene correctly. So when I move this, you can see that it moves around the 3D cursor over here. So now I will just start by rotating it around the Z-axis to line up the cube a little bit better. I will hide the motion tracking stuff and just focus on trying to line up the X-axis over here. In this case, I want to line up the X-axis with this over here, so I will just click G and then Y and move the camera a little bit and then rotate it again around the Z-axis. And now I will move the cube up 1 unit. And as you can see, we have a bit of sliding, and to fix this, I would actually recommend you to pick 3 other points as the ground. So if I use these 3 instead and see if I could get a better result with them. And now rotate it again and hide. You can see that we have a little better. But one thing I notice is that the cube seems to be a little bit under the ground. So I will just select the camera and move the camera a little bit downward. And as you can see, now it sticks much better, but it still slides a little bit, so I will continue moving it down. And now, as you can see, it sticks to the scene pretty good. You can see that it doesn't slide. For example, here, the X-axis stays. So, the next step is to go into the FlaxFlow panel again, and now we can start by using the Add Geometry panel. So, the first feature here is the automatic one-click geometry feature, and as it says over here, if you hold Control Shift right click, I believe that corresponds to Command Shift right click in Blender. So now if I use Control, Command and then right click on any feature, make sure that you are in the motion tracking panel and then inside the 3D viewport. And now when I click, for example over here, with right click, you can see that a point gets added, and now you actually saw that I clicked over here, but the point got added over here, and this is due to the camera's distortion that we estimated. So to fix this, either you can go in here and try to adjust the shift values, but I would not recommend you to do that. Instead, go into the solver panel over here again, and now lock the optical center and distortion and actually adjust all of these parameters to 0. Once you do that and resolve with using Flax Solver, only the focal length gets adjusted. Now we may need to fix the camera's position a little bit again, something like that. And now when I use the automatic one-click geometry again by holding Shift, Command and then right click, you will see that the point gets added exactly where I clicked. So if you want to use the automatic one-click geometry, make sure that your optical center and lens distortion parameters is set to 0, which it is in this case. So if I just use this feature and right click down here and now select all of them and click Ctrl and J to join them as one object, and then go into Edit tab and click F to create a face between them. Now when I play this, you can see that we have a perfect geometry for your door. So for example, if I would like to create the geometry of this entire scene, we can do this very easily by just, if I remove this, we can hide this and just start clicking. If I click over here, join all of the trackers, hit F, we have a good floor. And due to this thing being in the way, I will just adjust this a little bit to the right so it gets perfectly aligned. And as you see in this case, the wall actually goes a little bit out like this. And to fix this, I will just create a loop cut like that and just move this a little bit to the right. This wall was really weird, so I need to adjust it a little bit further with some loop cuts. And now we already have a great floor. So now I can just select these sides and increase it upwards. And if I go into the visibility tab in the viewport and change it to wire mode and add some subdivisions, we could see that it sticks really well to the geometry. And just like that, we could very easily and very fast create the entire geometry of the scene. Another way to do it is to use the manual one-click geometry, which I will describe in a little bit. But first, I will describe the settings that the automatic one-click geometry uses. So the first one is the locator pattern size, and this works just as the pattern size as the regular trackers use. So for example, if I increase the pattern size to, for example, 100, it will look at a much bigger area when it tracks the features to then later on try to estimate that tracker's 3D position. If I increase the search size, it will increase the search size for that tracker's area where it tries to find the tracker for each frame. And lastly is the locator track limit. In this case, I had set it to 25, which is the default value. When you right click on a point, it will add a tracker on that position and then track that tracker 25 frames forward and then 25 frames backwards, and then use the pattern size and the search size as I just talked about. And based on the movement on that tracker, it will then try to estimate that tracker's 3D position. So the next is the manual one-click geometry feature. It allows you to get the 3D position of any point, even if you have some lens distortion or optical center shift. So this works in all cases, so you don't need to have a 0 as distortion parameters. So to use this, hold Control Shift middle click, or on Mac Command Shift middle click, and then click on a feature you want to get the 3D position of. So for example, in this case, I will just use this feature over here, middle click with the mouse. Then when I clicked it one time, it will send a raycast from the current view. Then you need to move the playhead a little bit forward, and then you click it one more time, and that will send a second raycast, and then it will try to find the closest intersection point between those raycasts and use that as the 3D position, as you see here. So if I click it one more time, then move, then click again, you will see that a point gets created over here. So to speed up this workflow a little bit, I've created a jump feature. If you enable this, it will jump this many frames each time you use the manual one-click geometry. So for example, if I change this to 40 and go to the frame 60 over here, and then click on this little thing over here, and use Shift, Command, and click over here, you can see that it first sends the raycast to that position, but it also moves the playhead 40 frames forward, which allows you to very easily add points like this with no need for you to scrub through the footage manually. And as you can see here, and if you notice that any point gets inaccurate when you use the manual one-click geometry approach, that might be due to the intersection point not being so easy to find. So for example, if I disable the jump feature and then click over on this point and then just move it maybe 2 frames and then click again, you can see here the point does not get so accurately positioned, and that is due to the intersection point not being so easy to find. So here is a quick demonstration what I'm talking about. So if this is the first frame you use to send the first raycast, and it looks a little bit like this, and then you move the camera a little bit to the right and then send a new raycast on that same position, as you can see that the intersection point is very hard to find between those raycasts that you just created. So to fix this, I recommend you to use a larger motion difference between the 2 frames you send the raycast from. So for example, in this case, if you use this frame to send the first raycast and then the next frame to send the other raycast, you can see that this creates a much clearer 3D position, creates a much clearer intersection position between the two raycasts. So just as a quick tip, always have enough location difference between the two frames in order to get a good 3D position for your intersection. So now if I would instead use a jump amount of 100, it should be enough to create a clear intersection point. So if I move back to 60 and then click over here, you can see that it creates a much larger jump. And now when I move it forward, you can see that the 3D position gets much more accurate. And this also allows you to very easily create the 3D geometry you want. So for example, if I click over here, then here, and continue doing that, you can see that we can create accurate floors like this with using the manual approach too. And lastly is the point cloud geometry feature. And when you use this, it will add a grid of the automatic one-click geometry points. So if I show you this, in this case, I just have 10 and 10. And now when I click add 3D geometry from frame, it will add a grid of those automatic ones. So when I click this now, it takes a second to load. And now you can see that we have created a 10 by 10 grid of 3D positions. If I would like to get a more accurate point cloud, the only thing I gotta do is to increase this to, for example, 30 and 30. And in this case, it will create 30 times 30, so 900 trackers. And now when I click add 3D geometry for frame, it will take some time to actually calculate 900 3D positions. But now you will see that all of the positions are calculated. And if you notice that some of the trackers does not get a accurate position, you can try to adjust these parameters. So for example, if I increase this a little bit to, for example, 45, and then increase the track limit to, for example, 40, it will take a little bit longer time to load, but the 3D positions should be more accurate now. So just like that, we got a little bit better. But as you see, some of them are still not quite good. So you could try to play around with the locator size and pattern size. So if I would just delete them now and increase this to a very high number, to for example 50 times 50, now it will create 2,500 points. This will take some time, so make sure that you don't close the program just because Blender freezes. So just like that, now we have 2,500 points in the entire scene. You can still see that some of the points not get calculated accurately. So to fix this, I would just recommend to go into edit mode, go into wireframe, and then just delete those manually as you would with any other 3D point cloud. So just like that, now we only save the good points. And now you can see that we have a pretty good representation of the entire scene. So now I think you have a pretty good understanding of how to actually use the FlaxFlow add-on. Of course, I do not have the time to go through all of the settings, but at least now you have a good understanding of the fundamentals. If you still have any question that you want me to answer, make sure to leave the question in the comments and I will try to answer them as best as I can. You can also contact me here on Blendermarket and I will try to answer as best as I can. But aside from that, if you liked it, make sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel. But I will see you next time.